Hello and welcome to Season 4, Episode 21 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading Alan Ryan's On Politics, a book describing the history of political theory from Herodotus to the modern day. And this time we are talking about Tocqueville and Democracy. A very interesting chapter. But before that, you could still win a free Unlimited Opinions t-shirt for completely free. By just leaving us a review on any podcast platform.
Have you checked to see if we've gotten any reviews
lately? I checked a couple days ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no reviews. Well, no new reviews, I guess I should say. We have some reviews from the past. Leave us a new review and reach out to us, and we will send you a free t-shirt.
Which reminds me, we need to order the t-shirts.
We still need to order the t-shirts, yes.
Let's do that tonight.
Okay.
I've said that the last couple episodes.
Yes,
We're
that
going
is
to do
true.
it tonight.
That is true. All right, this episode, we are, of course, talking about Tocqueville and Democracy. Do you have any opening things you want to say about Tocqueville?
Do you?
No.
I don't either.
All right, let's get into it.
Yeah, I think... do you think people are generally familiar with him? I think they are. They should be, but I don't know if people really
I'm
know
not
who he is.
familiar.
Oh, really?
No, not really, no.
Have you
I knew
ever
nothing
heard
about him. I knew
Really?
I heard bits and pieces, but I knew nothing about him before this.
Yeah. I didn't know much about him personally.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yes, but we start out with the unlikely author of Democracy in America. And Alan Ryan kind of says that the most significant account of American democracy was written by a French aristocrat who was only 25 when he traveled through America in 1831 to 1832. So kind of strange that this even happened. But to give some background, Alexis de Tocqueville came from an ancient and distinguished family. He was born in July 1805 after his parents narrowly escaped death in the Terror. His father, Hervé, became a monarchist and a legitimist and worked as a courtier administrator in Versailles until 1830, and his father died in 1856, which was only 3 years before his son. He was brought up in a pious conservative household. He was confided to the care of Abbé Lesueur, who was contemptuous of liberalism but worked diligently to foster Alexis's intellect. He wanted to study law and joined government legal service. He was appointed Judge Auditor in 1827, but this ended in 1830 with the Revolution putting an end to the Bourbon monarchy and installing Louis Philippe. Soon after, he and his friend Gustave de Beaumont, suffering agonies of conscience and swearing allegiance to the new government, devised a plan to leave the country and study the American penal system. And so they arrived in New York on May 9th, 1831, and Democracy in America, of course, Alexis de Tocqueville's most well-known work, was based on this trip, and the publication of the first volume of this work was in 1835, and this made Tocqueville famous. And the second volume, being published in 1840, led to his eventual election to the Académie Française. At the age of 30, he married Mary Motley, who was at least 6 years older than him and a devoutly Catholic woman, while he was a dilute deist, but the marriage was oddly successful. He was then elected to the National Assembly in 1839, and the upheavals that began with the Revolution of February 1848 that evicted Louis Philippe left him in an intellectual panic. After General Cavaignac was defeated by Louis Bonaparte in the presidential election of December 1848, Tocqueville accepted the post of foreign minister, although he detested Louis Bonaparte, but he lost the office when the Barrault government fell, although he remained a member of the National Assembly. But this also ended with Louis Bonaparte's coup d'etat in 1851, and ill with tuberculosis. Tocqueville then led the life of a retired scholar until his death in 1859. So that is a brief summary of Alexis de Tocqueville's life. Did all kinds of stuff.
Well, there was so much upheaval during those years in France, and that gives a good context of his writing. Although a lot of it happened before his writing happened before a lot of that happened, because he was very young, and it's still jarring to me. Somebody who's a little bit more than double his age, that guy has done so much at age 25, and of course it's a different time and all that, but really impressive. You talk about these historical figures of American history, or really world history, how much they get done at such a young age.
Yeah.
And then, I'm sure we'll have some areas that will criticize him, but he was 25. He's in his 20s when he's writing this stuff, and to have enough wisdom and sense and talent to write this stuff down is pretty impressive.
Very true. Then move on to discussing, his motivation behind writing Democracy in America. And this section opens with a good quote. He says, Tocqueville's ideas have been exploited by left and right. Modern conservatives praise his strictures on big government and his enthusiasm for decentralization. Many American liberals praise his concern with association and community, and everyone praises his devotion to political liberty. American politicians bask in his praise of their political system and overlook his contempt for the coarse appearance of the members of the House of Representatives.
Right.
Few readers notice his enthusiasm for the brutal methods of punishment he found in American prisons, and not many notice the repressiveness of his views on family life.
Yeah, after reading this, and I have not read Tocqueville directly. Like I've read, of course, I assume it was in French.
Yes,
I don't
presumably.
I can't read it. But I have not read a translation. I have studied, summaries of it and excerpts of it, and you see it. And I don't know if I've seen it recently, but I've seen it over the years in conservative publications talking about the essence of what America is and trying to reclaim that type of independent, self-supporting ethos from when Tocqueville was, roaming the countryside, visiting all the jails. And so I've decided I'm going to read him. I think I have like 10 books that I'm either reading or about to read or halfway through, and I'm going to add that priority to the list.
Yes. You always have a stack of like 10, 15 books kind of just somewhere around the house.
Yeah, and yes.
Well, half of them have bookmarks like halfway through them.
Correct.
So you've read parts of them, but you never finish.
Well, no, now I'm on a kick where I'm finishing. So I'm not going to start anymore until I finish the one I'm reading now. I'm reading a book about the Alien and Sedition Acts during Adam's tenure. I just finished Polk's biography. So I've decided I'm going to do that because now generally I read usually like 3 books at a time, not like at the same time.
Yes,
but
that'd be impressive.
But if I need some light reading, I'll read this type of book. But if I'm like more into more intellectual or political or philosophical, then I'll do a different one, or I'll do maybe I'm reading some fiction. And I'll have 3 of them going at the same time because depending on what my mood is that day, I may want fiction. I may not want a philosophical tome, or So
yes, very
I'm
true.
sure there's a lot of people like me.
Yes,
I think
that is in that regard, yes.
All right. Anyway, what were we talking about?
Yes, we were talking about his motivation in writing Democracy in America. And Alan Ryan says his French interest in the U.S. Sprang from the failure to bring the Revolution of 1789 to a successful conclusion. Of course, that's what we think of as the French Revolution. But of course, there were many revolutions, in quick succession after that, pretty much, as we just saw.
Well, the big one with the terror is just so. It was so destructive and so terrifying. I mean, that's what they call it,
the terror. Yes.
But in the thoughts of Tocqueville, as described by the author, are really interesting about how, and we'll get to that, I'm sure. But how he viewed how America was successful, and he was, and as the author is saying, he was writing this book for a French audience. Okay, this is why they're working now, and we keep having overthrowing the government and lack of stability.
I really like what he says here. He says, like, the big question is how had Americans created a free, stable, and constitutional government while France in 41 years had gone from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy to the declaration of the republic to mob rule to the terror to mass murder to a conservative republic. He says, the Americans were coming from a position where they were self-governing, and then the British came in, and then they just kind of kicked out the British, although they were technically British colonies the whole time.
Right.
It was just a reversal back to what they were used to.
Well, and they get, I don't know if you're going to get to it now, I can't remember what order it's in, but it's a really good point about how the British government, almost by necessity, had a very hands-off approach to the colonies. So they were colonies, and there was some authority from England, but they were so independent, they're already running the same show. And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, I think, about how the American Revolution was really just kind of switching out who the ruler was, but all the other day-to-day operations and the culture remained the same.
Yeah.
Everybody was by necessity self-sufficient. It was very difficult a period of American history. I mean, there was no safety net, and I'm sure people starved to death, especially out in the wild. If you went out, well, it'd be later years, like say you went out to the Ohio River Valley and you started, you're just gonna be a homesteader and you're gonna try to, build literally a cabin and plant crops and all that stuff with your family. You get one bad season, and you're all going to starve to death because you're out in the middle of nowhere, or you're going to get killed by the natives or some other rival or something. So
True.
It was, they were self-sufficient, and we praise that, but it has drawbacks too, you know, to have that sort of limited government. So I acknowledge that, although that, you know, we've gone kind of the opposite direction in the present day.
True.
Very, very much more French-like, I think, now.
Yeah. We'll get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
But what he says
That was
here...
my foreshadowing.
Yes, that was good foreshadowing.
Thank you.
Yeah, stay tuned to hear what he's foreshadowing about. But a stable political order that was both democratic and liberal needed distinctive social, moral, and economic attachments. And this is kind of where he draws on Montesquieu. He says Montesquieu had studied these, and this is sort of now known as the political culture of a country. And that's really what Tocqueville was studying in Democracy in America, was really the political culture of America. He says the new republic reinforced American culture by giving an immense attachment to the political system, which helped it to function effectively, and this effectiveness led to more attachment. So it's kind of a cycle of, you know,
Right.
people being in support of this government because it works well, and because it works well, they're more in support of it.
Right.
He says this indirect supports combined popular sovereignty and individual liberty. So there's still very core tenets of this. He says Tocqueville was particularly impressed with the role of women. He says they have almost complete freedom as girls and become guardians of respectability when married. They exercise a benign moral tutelage to ensure enough men were public-spirited and law-abiding. So he was very impressed by women.
Well, and I think that's very true. I can't speak to other cultures, but like Western culture in society, I've often thought that the women were essentially domesticating influences on men, and in a good way. You know, when you get married and you settle down, and I think that's the one thing. Well, one of the things that I think the feminist movement really failed to recognize and to build upon is the important roles that women had in the family unit and in our society, and like the focus on equality really denigrated the areas that the women were superior.
Well, I think,
and, you know, like you're trying to be more like men.
Yeah, well, it's the
in
case
many
that I think
respects.
it should be, you know, equal does not mean identical. You can be equally treated
Correct.
while not being treated as identicals, essentially.
Right.
I think that's, you know, blurring the line between, you know, what is a man and a woman as we've seen now is ridiculous.
That's just silly, and I think that's passing. Or at least I hope it is.
We'll see.
But I'm more talking about like the 1960s feminist movement, which were justified, and there were a lot of good changes. But I think they didn't recognize how much power they already had without the institutional power.
Well, it's the case, you know, women are better at some things and men are better at different things. I think, you know, we have different temperaments just as we are, but I mean, it's you know, not to say that one should have the right to vote and not the other. You know, I think that's, you know, the equality, not identicality, I guess.
Well, and I think who was the who were we just talking about last week that
John Stuart Mill?
Yeah, about the thank you. I forgot the name. Where he viewed like the vote of a married woman to be a joint vote with the husband. You know, and Tocqueville probably would agree with a lot of that, and how women influenced the decisions of men so much that they really were a team.
Well, I think that was Bentham that said that,
That's
or either
right.
James Stuart Mill. But John Stuart Mill was all in favor of women's
That's
suffrage.
correct.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right.
Yes.
You're right.
Just to correct you.
Yeah,
But now we move
thank
on
you for correcting that mistake.
to Tocqueville's influences. I'm going to run through these real quick. The first is Rousseau. And he says, although Rousseau was a philosopher and Tocqueville was a sociologist, Tocqueville was heavily influenced by Rousseau's thoughts on equality and individuality. There's this idea of the good and bad forms of individuality. The bad is this form of self-centeredness driven by envy and fear and potentially dangerous, inspiring us to drag others down to our level. And this good sense of individuality is a strong sense of ourselves as moral beings with duties to perform and rights to protect, inspiring us to cooperate with others to elevate moral and intellectual levels of all. It's this idea of, you know, where should the self be, the individual be in all of this.
Yes.
The next influence is Montesquieu. Montesquieu was a socially minded political analyst wanting to understand the impact of climate geography and domestic life in bringing up children to understand the political arrangements of society and induce loyalty to those arrangements. And he utilized the term moderation, which is the attitudes, allegiances, and beliefs that maintain a consensus on what is and isn't tolerable in a political order, and they determine whether a ruler is moderate or not. So another big influence on Tocqueville there. And the last is Francois Guizot, who was 18 years older than Tocqueville and was educated in Geneva and then Paris and became a literary figure and a professor. He gave a series of lectures on European history in 1828, which Tocqueville attended. And he emphasized the irresistible rise of the middle classes. He said the British had become successful because they absorbed this class into a stable political system, while the French failed to do this, leading to the explosion of the unutilized middle class energy in the French Revolution. And he says the sort of moral of Guizot's teachings is that democracy, in a loose and unpolitical sense that embraced an egalitarian social climate and social and economic mobility rather than universal suffrage and institutions to give effect to the popular will, was irresistible, but had to be directed by a wise political elite. When Tocqueville said in Democracy that a new political science was required for a new world, he was agreeing with Guizot.
Mm-hmm. Never heard of that guy.
Neither did I.
Yeah.
No. I know we covered Montesquieu and Rousseau in past episodes. Correct. So if this is your first episode of Unlimited Opinions, you can go back and listen to those if anybody is just now joining us.
Well, nobody was skipped ahead to this one. They
that is true. Well, maybe there's a bunch of people really interested in Tocqueville.
True.
And then goes on to talk about the Frenchness of democracy in America.
Did you get the report from the people about that we had 83% more?
Yes, I did. Yeah, on Buzzsprout.
Buzzsprout. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that all these different nations that people are listening, like Vietnam. What was it? Wasn't one India?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we get some Indian downloads.
We had a couple episodes. I think it was about the mythology. Probably picked some of those people up. I don't know if they kept going.
Yeah, it's like a Spotify Wrapped, but for podcast for our listeners who know what a Spotify Wrapped is. But some interesting stats there. Mm-hmm. I think. Well, the U.S. is of course our biggest country, and then I think it's the U.K. Yeah. And
We're heading in the right direction. I wonder if we can get 83% more this next year.
We can try, but we've been more successful. There is an increase.
Yeah, when you start so low, you can. It's kind of like the Chinese economy. After Mao, it's like we had a 10% increase. So, but 90% people are still destitute and starving to death.
That's unfortunate.
But we had a 10% increase in our economic output.
That's great. Well, our most popular episode is from season 2, episode 5. For some reason, people are drawn to this one.
Which one is that?
It was about Cuchulainn and the Red Guard, the Irish figure
is that right?
in Celtic mythology. Well, I guess, yeah. So people click on that one a whole bunch. And that was our most popular one of 2022. Huh. Yeah, what do you know?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt our
that's all right.
podcast.
That's an interesting aside. But the Frenchness of democracy in America. And Tocqueville largely contrasts between French and American attitudes and beliefs. He says where he has a chance to praise the French temperament and dispraise the Anglo-Saxon, he does. So he is still somewhat biased here.
Sure.
But there's a suggestion that Tocqueville went to America to see France more clearly. In America, he could discover what was really possible in France. But Tocqueville wasn't a Republican. He believed that constitutional monarchy was better for France. However, Louis XIV and his successors had undermined their position by hollowing out the social hierarchy. He said there was no shock absorber between the French nobility and the populace. And this idea that he kind of repeats throughout this is that privilege must have function. That's one of his big ideas. If you have certain privileges, it has to have a use. You can't just have them just because. Yeah,
we've talked about that before in the context of the French Revolution, where you had this aristocracy that was less than useless. And of course, I see a lot of parallels to our current regime in Washington, D.C., and you only have a few people there now that are worth anything, and they're just so corrupt, so many of them, that it's becoming dangerous, similar to what it was pre-French Revolution, because there was such contempt for the leadership. The middle class, who are just going about their business, who aren't political activists, will only get worked up to a certain degree if they think that they have an interest in it. That it makes a difference whether you support the current regime or not. And if we keep going down this path where we become more and more cynical about our political leadership and the political system and the criminal justice system, we're in dangerous territory. Because do we really, like if there's a coup, or is anybody really going to care? Well, I hope so. But I don't know anymore, because it's like, are you going to put your butt in the line for the Senate and the House of Representatives as is currently constituted, or for President Biden or Kamala Harris? A lot of people wouldn't. A lot of people would, and I'm not saying that it's just because of those individuals, but you see, administration after administration is very similar to the attitude that he's describing with regard to the people's view of the French aristocracy before, the storming of the Bastille it wasn't like it was an organized civil war revolution. It was actually a very small force, a very small, almost melting away of authority, and then the people in the countryside just kind of went along with a lot of it, and then the activists took over, and it's really dangerous. Anyway,
that is very true. He then talks a little bit about equality. And he says the central claim, of democracy in America, is that increasing social equality was an unstoppable force transforming Western society. It was a culmination of processes at work since the 11th century, and a new world required a new political science for analysis of this. He also suggests the process is of divine origin. He emphasized the contrast between the viewpoints of a human observer looking only at a small slice of time and God who grasps the process in an intellectual moment without generalizations or extrapolations.
What are your thoughts about that?
That equality is God's will? Or
like there's a kind of a divine path or divine intervention or divine plan for the development of equality among the people in democracy moving forward.
I don't know. I don't think I agree with it. My gut reaction is no, because I think the societies that we've created now are products of ourselves. I don't think God's plan was for the United States to have a House and a Senate and to have a president and a judicial branch and stuff like that. Like I don't think it is the case that God's plan was for this to happen. I think we've talked about whether or not God sees the future and things like that before. So I think my opinion might disagree with yours there. But
I don't know that. I think you convinced me. I think you convinced me on that one.
Have I?
Yeah, I think so. And also the existence of prophets refutes my entire theory.
Yes, of course.
Right.
I didn't even think to bring up prophets in that whole debate.
Yeah.
If you're just tuning in to Unlimited Opinions, our debate,
it?
Our debate was that you said that God does not know our future actions because that inhibits our free will if he knows it.
No, that's not what my argument was. My argument was that the future is unknowable even by God because it doesn't yet exist. And so he's omniscient currently for everything that has ever been created in the past or exists now, but we haven't created the future yet, so it doesn't exist, so he couldn't know it.
Yes. My argument is...
But if there's any belief in prophets, that's completely refuted because he's giving you some sort of guidance about the future that is known to him.
Yeah.
Anyway,
my argument is that he's just completely outside of time. It's not like he's looking into the future. He sees everything all at once. It's all the present for God. Is my argument essentially.
Right.
I think that goes back to Aquinas, really.
I think you've convinced me.
But back to the question you originally asked. No, I don't think the way that we've set up society and countries and such is according to a divine plan. I think it's largely because this is the way we've done it. I think some are definitely better and I think closer to God or holiness. I don't think that's the right word, but closer to right and justice, than I think others. But I don't think it's the product of God's will.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I think it's interesting that he's barely religious himself, some sort of vague deist, almost agnostic or atheist, and he believes in this divine path. And of course, I have a view of I look sideways at theories that any of this is God's plan, because if it's his plan, then he has some moral responsibility for how, when the plan goes sideways, or appears to go sideways, and there's mass murder and there's children being raped and tortured and stuff. It's like, well, if he's responsible for the good, he's got to be responsible for the bad, and the way I view it. So I tend to think that there's not this hand of God. Yeah, because otherwise he's picking winners and losers, and that it just complicates everything, I guess.
I think it might be true that every action has a purpose, but I don't think it's all according to some plan, if that makes sense.
I don't know that it makes sense. You have to elaborate.
Like, let me see if I can find the right words here, but it's like, I think everything that happens, I don't think it happens for a reason, but I think that there are consequences from that can bring good from them.
Everything?
I think most things. Okay. Maybe not everything.
Because you're already afraid he's going to bring up some really horrible example.
Yeah, no
kidding.
Like
the Holocaust?
Yeah, like the Holocaust, yeah. Well, I'm going to pull a Kanye and say I like everybody. Everything is good.
Well, I'm going to say something controversial. I think, I've said before, I think Kanye's got a mental illness and somebody just needs to help him out and all that kind of stuff. But he was almost saying something very good and brilliant when he said, that he loves the Nazis or loves Hitler because God, I'm sure, loved Hitler and loved the Nazis. They're human, you know, and we're all sinners. He doesn't, you know, it's like you hate the sin, love the sinner. And I don't think we can say that God hated them, you know, and so what gives us the right to hate them as individuals and as opposed to hate. Anyway, I'm not agreeing with the initial sentiment that Kanye mentioned, which is I love everybody, and that necessarily includes bad people. And that's a beautiful thing to say. But then he went off and
it's a little crazy. Yes.
Then he said, "But yeah, Hitler did a lot of great things." It's like, no, no. You know, and I don't agree with that sentiment, but it was almost a beautiful thing, and then it just completely went off the rails.
Well, I think my sort of thinking is that, you know, well, God loves us because we're all human, and because we are human and loved by God and that sort of thing, there is a natural path towards goodness that we can all go on, you know, depending on the circumstances of our birth. But of course, that doesn't necessarily happen. For some people, like Hitler, for example, did not follow the path towards goodness throughout his life. Right. Well, but it's not like it's a set in stone. This is what God is making me do. It's like there is a good path to follow that I think was, I don't know, purposefully made by God. There's some sort of divine purpose, I think, there, but not necessarily planned out, you know, set in stone. This is what, you know, God set out for me to do.
Interesting. Yeah, and all I was talking about is like, you know, like a parent is always going to love their kid no matter how bad the kid is. Yes. So it's like, you know, even when you see like people in present day, their kid's a serial killer, and you know, their mom still goes to court, you know, still prays for him, you know, still hopes for some sort of redemption, and dads do or whatever, you know. So that's what I'm talking about, because we're all God's children, and so that's what I was saying.
Yes, true.
But, it's hard for me to say that what path we're on is God's plan, but I think that's different than saying you're either on the right path or the wrong path.
Yes, right. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Yes, we should actually move into Democracy in America, Volume 1 versus Volume 2, just to give a brief overview before we get into them. The first volume was 18 chapters and 2 sections at a very brisk style. It begins with introducing the country, its history, and its constitution, and then shows the political system in action. It is firmly focused on the democratic political institutions in the federal system, and essentially answers the question of how the stable and lively democracy is maintained. So very much looking at like the factual stuff, you know, how does it actually work? Let's see it in action. The second volume has 4 distinct sections focused on the intellectual life of the U.S., the sentiments of the American people, the morals or les mœurs of a democracy, and how they come together to affect the political outlook of Americans. It has a slight change of focus from the success of a political system to the cultural failings of a mass society. So the first volume, much more optimistic in the actual system. Second volume, slightly more pessimistic in how it actually functions and the dangers that it can run into.
Right.
And so we start off with Democracy 1. What is he actually talking about here? So it begins with the idea of a new political science for a new world. Tocqueville wanted to reveal the essence of democracy by heightening some empirical phenomena and neglecting others to achieve a sharper picture of egalitarian forces in America. So looking, you know, really emphasizing some things here. And his main argument is that the people truly rule, and they rule without relapse into tyranny and anarchy. He says, you know, every position of authority is elective, or nearly every position of authority, and requires re-election, and the executives answer almost continually to the people. He says the majority rules, and while the majority is composed of peaceful citizens wanting the good of their country, the majority is omnipotent. He says there are no defenses against it. Therefore, the majority is sovereign and is absolute with no appeal against it. And so, therefore, it is despotic if you look at it, you know, according to the definition of a despotism.
Right.
He says it's not really answerable to the minority. However, he overlooks, as Alan Ryan mentions, the innumerable obstacles in the way of anyone attempting to exercise tyrannical power. So it's this idea, you know, if the majority has the absolute rule here, then it necessarily has to be a despotism. And it's kind of hard to argue against that, because if the majority is, you know, making the decision, you can't really say, well, there's not much of a defense against that, I guess. The minority can't just like veto the majority opinion, if that makes sense, except in some circumstances.
Right. And but you know, that's the beauty of the American Constitution, is that there are minority rights. There are individual rights, down to the individual person, that no matter how many people vote in favor of X, if it violates a Bill of Rights, it's not acceptable. And the election of judges is really, really disfavored in present day America. And in Missouri, it's known as the Missouri Plan, which has been exported to other states, where we have some jurisdictions, like the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court of Missouri, are appointed by a commission. A commission selects 3 candidates that sends it to the governor. The governor has to pick one of the 3. If he doesn't within so many days, I think it's 60 days, then the commission picks one of the 3. And that's for Court of Appeals, Supreme Court, and then certain larger counties that have adopted the Missouri plan. So St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Greene County, Kansas City area, and I'm trying to remember which one other ones. But here in our county, they're all elected, and that's not a great system either, because you can get some dummies in there that are partisan hacks, which we really had some more experience with recently. But boy, I really like the elected thing. I've practiced in both jurisdictions and got to know the process without participating in either one. I've never been running for office as a judge, but I've been on the campaign trail with them, and then I have friends that have been appointed judges, including Court of Appeals judges, that have gone through the appointive system, and everybody agrees that the appointed system doesn't take the politics out; it just takes the people out of the politics. So you have these special interest groups that get people on the commission, and then you have to lobby the commission members to get appointed. So my point of the whole long story is, back when he's writing this, all of the judges were elected except for, I guess, the Supreme Court. There really wasn't a big federal judiciary, and they had limited jurisdiction. They had only just fairly recently usurped the elected authorities by proclaiming them the emperors that decide the constitutionality of laws. It's become a real problem, and he's right. The majority should have that kind of accountability we have built in the system with elections. We throw these people out after 2 or 4 or 6 years to be in the office. And, like in here locally for our judges, it's every 4 years. But the federal judiciary is this monster, this gargantuan, fire-breathing, despicable group of people that are just taking away our rights and enforcing judgments against the people with no accountability, because they never get impeached, and they serve for life. And that has to change. Even under the Missouri system, they all have to retire at age 70. And we have to amend our Constitution, our federal Constitution, so that no judge can serve a day past their 70th birthday. So we can have these super elderly people that are just grasping with their withered fingers upon power in these thrones. I mean, if you've ever been to federal court, they're on a throne.
Really?
Literally a throne.
So it's like you walk in and it's the emperor scene from The Empire Strikes Back. He turns around in his swivel chair and he's cloaked and wrinkled and he's got his hands on the throne. Yes, from Star Wars. Yes.
Yeah, except for there's no hood. But there is a black robe.
There's a black robe.
That's exactly the case. Now, some of them are more attractive and not as old. But when they get to 70, they are, and very few of them will just retire. Yeah. Because why would they? Because everybody has to stand and do what what they're told of these judges. And anyway, so
in conclusion, the solution is to throw them in a big pit, like in The Empire Strikes Back, and blow up the Death Star.
I did not. No. Okay. I did not say that. I did not say. I just said just go find something else to do. Retire. See your grandkids. Maybe take a walk in the park or write a book or read a book. But get out of the way. Let's have some accountability, and we need to pare down the federal judiciary and pare down the jurisdiction over federal crimes, because they're taking over local law enforcement. There's a big thing in St. Louis City because they got an ineffective prosecutor and an arguably somewhat corrupt police force. And so, let's put it this way, without saying anything about the police force, there's a huge segment of the population in St. Louis City that just don't believe the cops. Okay, whether they're justified or not, I'll leave it to them. But they won't convict based upon a testimony of a police officer because they've had bad experiences or whatever. And so what the federal government is doing is they're federalizing these local law enforcement issues, and they're bringing them into federal court, and you get a different jury panel. Instead of just having jurors from St. Louis City, it's from St. Louis City, St. Louis County. It's from like an 8-county region. They don't have that kind of experience with the local law enforcement, and then they're just racking up federal time for a bunch of people, and they're doing it, I think, for the right reason, because they have so much crime that's not being effectively prosecuted, and they can't get these people locked away that are really dangerous. But it's a really usurpation of the state law enforcement. Anyway, so I agree with Tocqueville and how it was set up then. It is not the system now, and it's a real big problem that's underneath the surface and we have to get that under control. Well, you saw it with Trump, with an individual judge from Hawaii issuing an injunction against an entire immigration system, or what was the other thing that they have these individual federal judges acting as if they're regents or what was the Roman. They had the Senate, and they had these two people that could veto any law that was passed because that was their authority. But even then, they had like a 2-year term or something. Yeah. These guys are on there for life. Anyway, end of rant. That was like a 10-minute rant.
That was. Back to Democracy in America, Volume 1. He says the constitutional arrangements intended to do two things at once. They establish an effective national government and also prevent any factionalism from occurring. However, he agreed with some other thinkers that the laws that were set up were really parchment barriers, and the omnipotence of the majority runs deep. And he distinguished between the highly organized French-American settlements with strict and efficient governments and the British-American settlements, which were unorganized and spontaneous and really just organized to the settlers' likings. And that's really where he says, kind of provides les mores, or the morals of the American people.
Right.
Is really everything they set up was self-governed just by them. And he says, the French government, they were building up, strategic forts and, villages in the right places along, like the Mississippi River and stuff like that. And there's this attitude of, well, the government's going to do everything kind of right for us. This is where he runs into some problems. He says the Englishman won't live under a government he hasn't consented to, and will stick patiently to the task that he has set himself and beat the wilderness into fertile farmland and pasture, whereas the Frenchman, in search of glory, is ready to succumb to the charms of the wilderness and may accept the boundaries of the present world. He says the Englishmen of this kind set up the institutions that amplified the authority of the majority, and every institution is an instrument of public opinion. It's this idea kind of battling two things at once, because it seems contradictory that the Frenchmen, are in search of glory while also, kind of giving in to a higher power. But he kind of frames it as, in comparison, the Englishman, isn't really in search of glory. He's really just looking to do what is right for him, and therefore, he'll resist any government that he hasn't consented to because it's not right for him. But the Frenchman, in search of glory, will search for glory within the bounds of what he is given.
And I tend to agree with the conclusion. I don't know if I agree with all the reasons, meaning that there would have been a cultural difference, but I think the difference between the English system is that the English weren't really setting up the operations, and so the local government set up by the English territorial populace were by necessity. They had to come together and say, okay, this is what we're going to do for X, Y, and Z, and we need to have people that will be guarding this area, or protecting this trade, or whatever, and setting up the courts, and how we going to adjudicate these issues and the criminal laws, how they're going to be, so you don't just have chaos. And so it was a bottom up rather than a top down. So I think he's right about that, and I also think that there was a different type, if I know correctly, there was a different type of immigrant that was coming with regard from the English colonies, because it was like homesteaders. Like they were coming there with their family, they're trying to put down roots, and like he describes it very well, they're going to basically plow it under, and no matter what's in their way, they're going to systematically, day after day, just take over the land and take it from the Native Americans, as opposed to just a lot of the French fur traders that were more like equals, or occupying the land with the Native Americans and trading with them, as opposed to get out, it's mine now. And so I think he's right about the conclusion. I don't know about that it was exactly the way he describes it.
True.
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Of course, I wasn't there then.
He goes on to say, you sure weren't. He goes on to say that America remains free because Americans are self-reliant, uninclined to exert power over one another, and organize their lives with little assistance from the government. He says here on page 751, let me see. He says, Tocqueville writes wryly about the contrast between France and America as regards the invisibility of central government. Americans respond to the absence of the tutelage that the French state aspires to provide by organizing themselves to provide what they need for themselves. Everything hangs together. Tasks like jury service force Americans to play a part in public affairs and provide a form of political education. Vast numbers of local newspapers reinforce this political education, and their varied allegiances ensure that the uniformity of opinion to which democracy is vulnerable is constantly broken up and has to reform against opposition. if this was a checklist of what makes people free in America today, we would not check many of those boxes.
We certainly
I have to say.
We wouldn't check the newspapers with varied allegiances.
Yeah.
And that's a real problem. And they just, people don't recognize it. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, where we had partisan press during this time, and that meant like like I mentioned earlier, I read Polk's biography. Well, there was I think it was Boston Republican or about Boston. I forget I can't even remember what the name of the newspaper was, but there was a newspaper that was known as affiliated with Polk. You know, I mean, it was always going to support Polk, but it also had other news in there, and you get the viewpoint from the then Democratic Party. And then there were other papers that are the exact opposite, which would have been at the time Whigs. But you knew that, and then people would get different viewpoints. And today it's really hard. I mean, it's not saying that it's completely one-sided over all media, but boy, there's a big difference.
Well, I think one of the big problems too is that I think it's just as partial, but under the guise of impartiality. It's, CNN is just reporting the facts. They're not inputting their opinion, or the Washington Post, or, Fox News, if you want to. And it's like, well, I think people are starting to realize, there are, stereotypes about what to expect from each one, but still, it's not, stated, I am a Democrat and I'm writing this article, or I'm a Republican and I'm writing this article. It's, I'm an arbiter of the truth. Yes. I'm just the news.
Yeah, and I think what I'm really encouraged by in the last year is these Substack reporters like Barry Weiss, Matt Taibbi, and some others that are of the left. And what they're saying is, we're of the left, but we're trying to tell you the truth. We're doing our best to give you the truth, but we are of the left. And I think that's just so refreshing, because I'm going to listen to people who disagree with me politically. What I'm looking for is honesty. I put your opinions in there, but give me the facts too, and give me a disclaimer, okay? And instead of, like you said, acting like you're an independent arbiter, and you got Chuck Todd, who's just such a hack. And you got these other people that are just such hacks.
I hope Chuck Todd isn't listening to this.
I hope he is, but he knows he's a hack. Well, I don't know if he does. He's so stupid. He's just so stupid, and maybe he doesn't know that he's a hack. But he is. He's clearly a partisan, and he's a stupid partisan. He doesn't even know the facts. He doesn't read anything. I think it's like he isn't even aware that there's a possibility that Hunter Biden sold this country out. Basically Joe Biden did it through Hunter Biden. And I think that's a real possibility. I mean, it's not fantasy land, and people like Chuck Todd will never understand that, because they don't even look at it. It's like they don't even read. God, it's frustrating.
Yes. Let's get back to Democracy, Volume 1. He says, the antagonism of opinions is vital in America. He says, America thrust itself westward. Different regions had different interests and saw the world differently. So all kind of checking the opinion of everybody else.
Yes.
Then he goes on to talk about religion. Interestingly, he says, religion also kept Americans self-disciplined and respectable. He says, religion is a central part of les mores. And I think I found a place where Alan Ryan is just wrong in this book. He says, on page 752, he says, the Americans had contrived a surprising device for making religion a powerful social force. They had written the complete separation of church and state into the Constitution. Of course, we have talked about before, church and state, the separation of church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. It was decided by a Supreme Court case that pulled from one of Jefferson's letters. But I made a note here.
It is just from Jefferson's letters, but even within the Supreme Court cases, there's no true separation of church and state.
Yes.
And I've written in my margin with an arrow, nope.
Yep, I figured.
We both caught that one. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yes, but what I was saying, I think what he's really talking about is he's talking about there's no national church enshrined in the Constitution. That's what the point he's really getting at, which avoids the problems of the unpopularity of both church and state in France, which is what Tocqueville was comparing it to.
Yeah, it has a multiplier effect in the negative.
Yes.
To have an official church religion, because it undermines both at the same time. And that's what he's saying, and he's absolutely right. But he overstates it.
Yes.
Or misstates. It's really just I think it's more grammatical than, because I put on their note, and then as I'm reading, I'm like, what is he going with this? But he's absolutely right about describing it as not having an official church religion, rather than a constitutional separation of church and state, which is nowhere in the Constitution.
Yes, true. And then Democracy Volume 1 ends with the somber reflections on the three races, which Tocqueville describes as the white Europeans, the American Indians, and the black slaves. And he goes and he talks about the extinction of the Indians as a moral disaster, not just because of the cruel treatment and the violation of treaties on the American side, but also because it destroys an aristocratic way of life. He says the Indians' cultivations of honor, courage, and the virtues exemplified everything that democracies are in danger of losing. I thought this was interesting. It reminded very much of Joseph Campbell,
Yes.
And sort of the approach that, well, what do the Native Americans have to offer here? What are their values and such? And
Right.
it's a shame that we lost some of that, and I think so too.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, I thought it was a very creative way to praise them.
Yeah. All right, we're going to move on to his talk about the situation of slaves, which he also thought was understandably intolerable. He says, but not just because, of the cruel treatment of slaves, which was awful, but it was damaging for the white inhabitants of America too, as free labor obviously leads to more prosperity. And so when you have comparative levels of well-being, which determine whether a population is happy or resentful, the Southerners will increasingly resent Northerners because they'll be more prosperous in the North because they're not relying on all the slave labor. They'll have the industrialization and such. But he also said that the misery for black slaves was also that emancipation would probably not do them much good because even in the North, they weren't, let's have all of the slaves come up here and work for us, as not exactly an easy solution.
Yeah, and that is not known by a lot of people in modern times, that it's not like it was just the South.
Yeah.
Okay. The entire country was racist. You didn't have, if you were a free black in Massachusetts or New York or Maine, you're still in deep trouble.
Yeah.
All right. You're not going to go on a date with a white lady, right? That's just to state the obvious. But I mean, there was systematic racist oppression through the entire country. And so it kind of galls me a little bit. We're like, well, it was the good versus evil. I mean, granted, it was better, not having slavery. And I do think that the people that were really fighting against it were brave to do so. And our country sacrificed a lot of brave soldiers to end it. And there was a struggle going on for decades over this issue before the Civil War broke out even. And then the institutional racism, it took decades after the Civil War to get us to, what was it, 1960s? We finally got rid of any formal legal racist system.
True.
The true systematic racism.
Yes.
It was finally ended, not too long ago.
Yeah.
I mean, it was before my lifetime.
Before my lifetime, too.
Certainly before your
Yes,
lifetime.
yes.
But that was, years before I was even born. But anyway.
Yes.
But yeah, so I think I said enough.
I think so, too.
Okay.
Moving on to Democracy Volume 2, sort of the question is, well, what else is still left to discuss about America? You described all the systems and everything.
Right.
He says that there are still several topics that are left to discuss. And the first is the ambivalence about individualism and individuality, the American genius for association, thoughts on the family, and soft despotism, which is what we'll be talking about for the rest of the chapter. But he also thought that democracies were unfit for producing high culture, and he regarded American life as frenetic and monotonous. He didn't think that great American philosophers were even a possibility. He also believed that the effect of equality was to make Americans more enthusiastic for equality than freedom, which might be the case.
Yeah.
Who knows? Then we move on to individualism and retreat. And this was really interesting, I thought, his distinction here. He says, individualism is the polar opposite of individuality, which is a strong sense of our identity and the confidence to make something of ourselves. But he gives the definition of individuality. He says, it is reflective and peaceable sentiment that disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of those like him and to withdraw to one side with his family and friends, so that after having thus created a little society for his own use, he willingly abandons society at large to itself. He says, this retreat from a public world to the domestic world, it is not really selfishness, but a retreat from engagement altogether. He says, Tocqueville wanted to see fully engaged citizens, not docile breadwinners, and set out both the dangers of individualism and how you resist it. And of course, how you resist it was with associations and self-interest, rightly understood. And Tocqueville was amazed by how Americans set up societies and clubs and associations, especially non-political ones. He says, they established schools, they built churches, they sent out missionaries, they created hospitals and prisons. So basically, everything you can think of could be solved with an association or a club here. He says the existence is vital to America. He says in a society without aristocrats, individuals have to cooperate with one another to achieve almost anything. And this is the cradle of self-reliance, is this idea of the association. He says, following Montesquieu, he saw the natural political condition of a society of equals as a tyranny, where a single despot ruled a state that controlled individuals who lacked the power to resist and had no way of organizing themselves to do so. America was the reverse of such a society. Non-political associations fostered the skills of government so that America was a genuinely self-governing republic. But if the state were to intervene to take over what was done by voluntary association, the spark that kept freedom alive might be extinguished. Sorry,
Yes.
Not distinguished.
They'd have a nice suit on.
Yeah, they'd have a nice suit on. Yeah, the flame would be very, very attractive. No, but this idea that, if the government takes over what the private sector can do well, it'll kind of put out any of that efficiency, I think is sort of the idea in the self-reliance.
I think he hits a nail on the head with regard to what's great about American culture, American society, is that sense that you're just gonna, if there's a problem, you just get a group of people together and fix it. And I've been thinking a lot about, I've mentioned several times about the struggle with dealing with high crime areas.
Yeah.
And the lawlessness in certain areas, and it's just so frustrating because there's such a tragedy and it's so close, and you figure you could do something. But I think this alludes to part of the problem, is that the attitudes of the people within the community are similar to the French as he describes them. Is that they just expect top down?
Yep.
They expect top down solutions, and that's never going to work. And that there needs to be no government funded organizations. I mean, they have churches, and there's a struggle there, and there are people that march and try to do things, but there really needs to be an uprising within the community and have a community group to patrol their own area and to solve the problems without any governmental interruption, other than just some cooperative, like if we call the police, you're going to show up, which would be helpful. And so I think that may be part of the real problem.
Yeah.
In those communities, because I know if we had a lot of problems in this neighborhood or this town, there would be a group of people would be getting together, outside of the jurisdiction of the city or the county or the state. We would, because our attitude would be, well, if they can't fix it, we're going to fix it. And I just know that would happen. And we have all these civic groups that do a lot of charitable work, like Rotary and Kiwanis and Optimus and Elks and the AMVETs and the Eagles. I mean, they're all over the place.
The list goes on and on, yeah.
It's almost as many as you have churches in this area. And they all do volunteer work. They all do civic good, and it has nothing to do with the government. It's just a group of people that get together and do good things. And I think that is the heart of American resilience.
Yeah.
And why we've lasted this long, and I think it's our future.
Well, that's what he says, self-interest is what is self-interest rightly understood, which counteracts that individualism, sort of the retreat from life. It's, this idea, if I want something, in the absence of the state, then we have to manage our own affairs. If we want to build a school, we got to get together and we have to build a school.
Right.
That's the way it used to be. I don't think it is now, because he says, kind of ends this section by saying, there's a danger of giving into the temptation to have the state do everything for us.
That's right.
I think
that's what we've done the last 40 years plus, and we've seen the results of it, and it isn't working. So we might as well just divest the government of that power and make people do it on their own.
Yeah, because I think the people who live in an area that has a problem will know the best way to deal with that problem. I think by and large. I mean, the federal government can see, there's a food shortage. They need food, and they can provide food for a limited period of time. But for the community to actually have food for a long time, they have to set that up for themselves.
That's right.
Yes,
that's right. Yep.
Moving on to the family, and interesting thoughts here.
Yeah.
Says he emphasized the need for social discipline. He says the way the next generation socialized into membership in a democratic society was dependent on the family and therefore on women as sort of the guardians of the family. He says the democratic family is contrasted with the aristocratic family. Sort of this nuclear family versus the extended family, because the idea of lineage is very un-American. In an aristocratic society, you're a very extended family. Oh, my great-great-uncle was a king somewhere, so I have money now.
It's so foreign to us, like when they talk about like that idiot Prince Harry and Prince William. That Prince William will be the king, but Prince Harry is going to be nobody. Well, he's nobody anyway because he's an idiot. but like it's such a foreign concept to American ears. Like, what do you mean that there's two sons and they aren't equal? I mean, that doesn't make any sense to any of us. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes. But he says the relations within a family are based on friendship rather than authority,
Right.
and sort of the democratic family as opposed to the aristocratic family. He says the preservation of good morals depends on women. And this is kind of what I talked about earlier, that American girls had absolute liberty until marriage, but within a strict moral framework. It's not just do whatever you want necessarily.
Right.
It's still within those moral frameworks. But this freedom is succeeded by a self-imposed subordination to the duties and welfare of the family. Says American women provide the stabilizing force for that family, which is an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I think it was true then, and of course we have a crisis in the family. We can go on like 20 different rants on that topic now, but I think this understates the stabilizing influence of men because it wasn't even a known problem in the society back then, and I think that's really where we're failing our kids is that either absentee dads or dads have been kicked to the curb or thought to be irrelevant. We're seeing problems.
It goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. There are differences in the temperaments of men and women. You need both sides of that to, I think, live a fully, developed socialization process.
Yeah. You're seeing, statistically, obviously, you look at it, and if you have a two-parent household, meaning a man and a woman, statistically, the kid's going to do better.
I think at some point, it's just going to be impossible to deny. Once you have all of these,
it's impossible to deny now.
Well, true, but I think
they do still deny it.
Yes.
And really what people are saying, they're advocates for, well, it's having two moms or two dads, or just having a single mom primarily, are saying, well, it's better than X. It's not ideal. I think that's really the fallback position. They're not saying it's better than having a man and a woman. I don't think there's anybody that really is advocating that it's better just to have a single mother. But they're saying it's better than having that idiot in the household, which I think makes some sense. It makes sense depending on the circumstances.
True.
But writ large, if you look at it as a societal problem or a social scientist, statistically, it's borne out that having a mother and a father, a male and a female in the house the kids do better.
It's like, you think having a mother and father in the house is better than not? Well, I think just having one mother is better than the kid being left homeless on the street. Well, it's like, yeah, well, sure, of course, but
yeah. So I don't think people are arguing with the statistics because it's so provable and has been for decades how destructive our current path is. But of course, then what's the solution? And I don't really know the solution. I have theories, but not any good ones. I always have a theory.
Yes. And then Tocqueville moves into a more pessimistic light, kind of, been pretty optimistic about the other, factors here, but this idea of soft despotism is very pessimistic. He feared a form of despotism unlike any other throughout history. He said democracies are unlikely to fall to traditional tyrants, but majority tyranny in a social context is more likely. Says there's a tutelary power that would be held over law, making an individual have boundaries confined to the family and a few friends. So kind of, retreating from association, this good form of self-interest. And he says here on page 761, traditional tyrants were like cannon firing high explosive into the countryside. If the shell landed where you were standing, you were dead. If not, life went on undisturbed. Democratic despotism is soft or mild, but it is uniform, omnipresent, and inescapable. In a memorable and much-quoted phrase, Tocqueville says of it, it does not tyrannize, it hinders, compromises, enervates, dazes, and finally reduces each nation to being nothing more than a herd of timid and industrious animals of which the government is the shepherd. So kind of removing all forms of that good self-interest, just making people sort of reclusive, not wanting to, engage in society.
What he's really describing there is democratic socialism.
Yes,
that's really what he's talking about, because if you have something that has individual rights, you're not going to. He's describing democratic despotism, which of course is democratic socialism.
Yes,
but I thought it was interesting how he describes what we have to fear was that the leaders would be their schoolmasters.
Yes,
rather than like some thug, forcing something. It's like, no, I'm doing this for your own good. And that's like the worst thing you ever want to hear from a governmental official.
Well, it's kind of what he's saying.
On any level.
It's falling into that temptation of the government doing what associations would do, these clubs and stuff. And from there, it's like, well, if the government is helping me here, then they know what's correct. Then they have, essentially what he says, this tutelary power. They are our schoolmasters, not necessarily just our representatives necessarily.
Yeah, mind your own business.
Yeah, exactly. But that kind of concludes Democracy in America, Volume 2. Just a couple other quick notes on France and empire. And Tocqueville had some interesting ideas here. He thought France needed a grand national project to bring the country together, and the conquest and settlement of Algeria could be that that adventure. I thought you would agree with this.
No, I don't agree with that. I agree with the principle that you need a grand national focus or a project.
Yes. What was interesting, Tocqueville did not invoke the benefits of progress in Algeria, but thought that the successes of national glory, the increase in self-confidence, and the solidarity of the French people outweighed the brutalities of the Algerian conquest. You know, it's worth it as long as we stick together, kind of. And it's like, I don't know about that one.
I guess he didn't like those dirty Algerians like he loved the Native Americans.
Apparently not. He did not did not like the Berber people.
Yes.
But he also believed that the growing American Navy would ally with France to check British supremacy, which is...
That was the hope.
That was the hope.
That was their hope.
Yeah. Back in the...
And it was unknown at the time, which way America would go, and if you'd be part of an alliance of one or the other. So it's interesting.
That is true. The last section in this chapter about Tocqueville is on one of his other three masterpieces, as they're called, of course, Democracy 1, Democracy 2, and then the Ancien Regime. He says, Tocqueville was very interested in the revolution, and so thought it was necessary to write about the regime that the revolution destroyed, and so wrote L'Ancien Regime, or just the ancient regime. And he, sort of refuted the claim that the revolution began because of the intolerable misery of the French people. He described reference group theory, what it's known as today, but this idea that states that whether we are content or unhappy depends on whom we compare ourselves with. Yeah. And so there are two ways that we can compare ourselves to other people. We either compare ourselves with those, we come in contact with. You know, if I come in contact with a rich person, I think they're better than me, etc. You know, I might be unhappy. Or we become very unhappy if we become very prosperous and then find our path up blocked. So if we start, succeeding and then we find that the road is cut off, then we become unhappy because, we were relatively happy compared to before, and now we can't go any higher. He says the second factor was the most crucial in the French Revolution. He says the French monarchy just had to not provoke the aristocrats in deciding with the peasantry, but it failed to do that. So you've asked why the French state was so vulnerable to revolution. The major reason was because the French aristocracy had become useless. This idea we talked briefly about earlier. It says the monarchy had reduced the aristocracy to political impotence, but allowed it to maintain its financial privileges and exercise power over the peasantry, sort of in exchange for taking away their political power, meaning that the aristocracy was hated more in France than anywhere else due to being completely functionless. He says the defense against disorder and pillage, should a revolution happen, is to give enough people a stake in law and order and the protection of property. It says in a stable society, there is a prospect for the middle classes that they can make their way higher, but this was not the case in France's caste aristocracy. And if your middle class has nowhere else to go, they're not going to be happy about it. It says irreligion also led to revolution because the aristocracy depended on the revolution, sort of the authority that these clergy had, and of course they were mingled with the aristocracy. They depended on that sort of blind faith in this power.
And they shared the same corruption. So that they lost their moral legitimacy to say, stop killing the nuns.
That's true.
A lot of truth to that.
But he says, before the revolution, administrative centralization had taken hold, and this remained post-revolution. He says the French had become uniform, and they expected the state to provide everything. They didn't have association or the capacity to build bottom-up loyalties rather than loyalty to the state. And that's really why he believes the French Revolution ended up failing, is because you had this revolution, you were mad at this government because it was so centralized and none of the power was really within the people. And then you kind of set up the exact same thing, set up the same problems that you were facing. And so it ended up being more revolutions after that. And that's what Tocqueville saw throughout the rest of his entire life.
And I think he's right. But also it's the arrogance of the people that were revolutionaries. Because it's not like when they took over, they trusted the people in the countryside to make decisions for their own regions. They didn't decentralize the power either. And so they could have created it.
Yes.
I think there's a possibility there because they still had, I'm not an expert on French history or how they organize things, but I believe they at least had regional authorities for the pricing, the purchase and sale of certain grains and farming produce and that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was already regional authorities. Of course, there was central control for them. But there was a way to divest the centralized power, and they didn't do it.
Yeah.
So then they made the same mistake. And I don't know. I think they could have really tried to foster the bottom-up or decentralized government that the United States had already created. But they didn't even try, I don't think. I think they're like, because they're so arrogant, they're like, well, we know what's best, and we're going to start worshiping reason and all that other BS.
And I think that's really what Tocqueville's goal was to see where the French Revolution went wrong, what America did better. Yeah. And it turns out kind of everything, I think, was his conclusion in some regards.
Yeah. I mean, the French Revolution was just horrible.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't overstate it. It was really, really bad. And the people were educated, so it's not like they're just had bloodlust and they're fighting for survival, meaning like if they didn't kill this faction, they were fighting over food, like well, we have to kill those people so we can eat that food that's in between us.
Yeah.
It wasn't like that. These were highly educated people that made conscious decisions to murder a lot of people. It was just really, really horrible. And I think that's what really was shocking to like the observers in England and in America that actually paid attention to it and saw it for what it was. But touching back on something that you mentioned the previous section about purpose, like a greater purpose for the country. And if you think about it, our country, the United States, has not had a purpose for years. That there was World War I, World War II, and there's like the Cold War, which is kind of like an overarching kind of focus where we have to fight the commies and keep them at bay. And that was a big thing. I mean, you may not realize it, but it was kind of all encompassing with regard to the purpose of the country. I mean, the space race was because of that, and then the wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell, and basically the Soviet Union just crumbled. And so that was 89.
Yeah.
And then we're kind of like, okay, well, it's now a unipolar world, and there was commentators saying we're at the end of history, which was really funny, because it's like we aren't going to have these conflicts anymore because we'll be the world's policemen. And then 9/11 happened, and then we had the war on terror and this all-encompassing fight against the terrorists and all that kind of stuff. And now that's over. I mean, we pulled out of Afghanistan, for good or for bad. And now what's our purpose? What's the point of the United States? What are we doing? Do we have any projects?
None that I could think of. Like the only thing that comes to mind is like Ukraine is like the big thing, but like most Americans, I don't think care about Ukraine.
No, correct.
I think
it's not an overarching purpose. It's a political class thing.
I think it's the same thing can be made for like North Korea and stuff like that, and then like Taiwan and China. It's like not too many people are really that set in stone. We need to defend these people. We need to help them because it's not really America's purpose. I think a lot of people realize.
Right. I don't think we have a big goal.
Yeah.
There's no big purpose. Like, what are we striving for? And we're not expanding.
I think that's, sorry to cut you off, but I think that's why a lot of people like Elon Musk too, with his whole, SpaceX program. It's something he has a definite goal in mind. And I don't think that's not something you see in a lot of, politicians. Well, a lot of politicians, I think, and a lot of, activists now are about climate change. That's the next big goal, I think, for America. We need to win the planet, I think, is what they're really pushing for.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
I think is the climate movement.
I'm completely disinterested in it because it's such a hoax. And there's no climate warming. The statistics that NOAA just released showed no warming for the last 6 years. Now that's a short period of time. But they've been talking about short periods of time for the last 20 years.
I saw this this clip earlier. It was over like the past decade or so.
Yes.
And it was a compilation of all of the headlines that claimed that one country was warming faster, twice as normal as the global average.
Right.
Australia's warming twice as normal than the global average. Right. Africa's warming twice as more as the global average. It's like,
impossible.
Which one is it? Which
Impossible.
is different news sites, different sources for all of them. So it's not just the same person just repeating the same thing over again. But it's major headlines all saying the opposite things.
It's crazy. But yeah, I guess for the left, they may have that goal. There's a lot of people. I always forget about that because I just think it's so bizarre and so nonsensical, and it's not a thing. and they really don't have a plan.
Yeah.
Right. So let's just say that actually that could be in the background of a plan, of a purpose, where you're going to change over the current energy focus on fossil fuels, but of course that has to include nuclear. It has to include some. It has to be. I would think it would be hydroelectric too. Because that's not going to be. And once you get the dams built, there's no carbon from that. Very little. I mean, of course you have machinery and stuff, but there is no plan going forward, no purpose. So I think that would be a good example if they actually had a plan. Really, what they want to just do is just say shut off the gas, but that's not a plan. Yeah. That's not something going forward. That's regressive. It's not okay. We're going to have this huge purpose to say figure out how to do fusion reactors. Yeah, which would be better than fission because you wouldn't have in theory the spent radioactive fuel, which would just has to be stored indefinitely now. And is where you can get like weapons grade plutonium, I guess, out of that. So it's really dangerous.
Well, I think the same argument can be made for the right though, because I think the right's biggest mission
there's no plan.
Well, I think it's to go back to the way things were. I think if a plan can be said, it is right. The conservative movement. If we need to go back to normalcy, but again, it's that neither I think side really has a forward-moving plan with a set goal in mind.
Correct.
I don't think either party does, and I don't think
that's right.
Really many countries as a whole do. Like I guess Russia's is to take back Ukraine.
And Ukraine has one there, and Poland has one to I'm sure it has a lot to do with the war and to push.
They have
Russian
some grudges,
bear back.
I think.
Push the Russian bear back and all that. Israel is to expand, and do you know? I think Bibi Netanyahu is now the prime minister again.
So,
Is that right? That guy's crazy. Anyway,
if
he's
not
got a new book
now,
out.
but soon.
Yeah, so I mean, some of them have a purpose. Iran, I don't know, destruction of Israel, probably.
Maybe. Well, China probably has one. Yeah.
Well, China is world domination. Yeah. They have a purpose, and they're going systematically over it. So yeah, we need to figure out. Okay, invade Canada? I don't know. But but you're right. It's interesting that we seem to just be floundering. We're playing around the edges. Yeah. We have no national purpose. We have to come up with an Adam.
Yes,
before the end of this season.
We will
define the national purpose.
I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Yes.
That sounds like a good column.
Do you have any last thoughts on Tocqueville?
Great writer, very influential, and pretty cool cat.
Yeah. I'm going to say one more thing briefly that I think I've mentioned before, but just the idea of sort of, where values and culture kind of fits into the politics of everything. I might have mentioned this before on the podcast. I know I've talked to you about this, but I think, the greatest, misstep of the Republican Party in the last, 20, 30 years. And of course, if this is a surprise to any listeners, I align more with the Republican Party than the Democrat Party. But just sort of the idea that we can, maintain, the way things are just through legislation and through the law purely, well, as long as we hold the House and the Senate, we're fine, we're good, no problems. But this idea of, we're kind of realizing, we call it the culture war now. And I think, that's really what Tocqueville is describing, is, where values and stuff fit in, sort of the right's just giving up of everything culture related, I think has been their biggest misstep.
Right, the retreat.
The past 30 years, yeah.
Yep.
So
longer than that.
Just this idea of, whatever the morals of the people are, that's going to be reflected in the society overall. I think there's no denying that at this point. We can't just say, well, we'll legislate it away. You're not going to do that. You have to actually be active in preserving the morals of a good society.
Truth. Tocqueville would agree.
Yes.
That's been going on since the 60s.
Yeah.
The Great Retreat, or the long march through our institutions by the left, however you want to look at it.
But I think just the give up of the right has been more recent and has been, I think, pretty disastrous.
And you see some people recognize this, like the Daily Caller with their media empire.
Daily Wire?
Daily Wire,
yes.
That's why I Daily Caller is affiliate with Tucker, I think. It's more of a news outlet, sorry. And then DeSantis with his little experiment with that liberal arts college where he's going to try to reform it so that it is a classical education college, similar to Hillsdale, which would be interesting to see if that liberal arts college, the more I read about it, the more obviously it was a failure. They only had like 600 something students.
Really?
And they were spending ungodly amounts of money. It was like the second most expensive to the state of Florida university, but it's like it costing them I think $19,000 per student.
Wow.
Per degree. And they had a huge dropout rate, and their acceptance rate was like a huge number, and a whole bunch of people that are accepted wouldn't go there. They apply multiple places, but they got in somewhere else. So that he has a unique opportunity because it was basically failing, and they're already talking about just shutting it down. So I think he's going about the right way. Okay, here's this thing. We were going to shut it down. Let's have an experiment. We're spending money after this thing anyway. And so if that can be successful, if you can get the right professors in the right administration, and then students who excel with this kind of return to normalcy in the curriculum, I think that's the way to go. And then you just have to build upon that. It's a long mission, but that's still not a purpose. You still have to have a national purpose, and it's hard to do when you have an imbecile in the White House.
That is true.
And before that it was Trump, and he had some big things right, but he also was kind of haphazard. What was the, although he had some global or big issue discussions about what he wanted to do in the world, and bring back whatever.
Yeah, but I guess sort of final thoughts are that a lot of the things that Tocqueville described as maintaining the freedom of America and the self-reliance, I think we're starting to see slip away. So we need to find a way to bring those back.
Amen, brother.
All right. Any other final thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, this has been Unlimited Opinions, Season 4, Episode 21. Win a free t-shirt. Leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
This has been our last in-person episode for a while, going back up to college. So it'll be virtual for the next few weeks at least. And then pretty soon we'll be moving into a new book. We'll have to figure out which one.
Yes, we do.
All right.
Any suggestions would be appreciated.
Yes, leave that in your review.
Yes.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Suggestion. Yeah. Because I know so many people are already typing their reviews right now as we speak. Leave us a suggestion for a book and win a free t-shirt.
Yep.